Guyana, and welcome to another edition of Conversations in State. I am Malika Ramsey. Thank you so very much for joining us today. A holiday, so those of you who may eventually see this as a rebroadcast, I trust that you don't get confused. But the original airing of this particular edition of Conversations in State is actually Arrival Day. So I take this opportunity to wish all of Guyana happy Arrival Day, and I trust that you're enjoying it thus far. On today's program, we're going to be focusing on the Civil Defense Commission, of course, CDC. They have been in the news a lot, and for very good reason, with good reason actually. And they're the ones who rescue us in time of need, the times when there needs to be rescue. And we would prefer if those times are very limited, but life doesn't work that way. And as we're focusing on the CDC, it is my pleasure to welcome to Conversations in State for the first time the Director General Acting, Lieutenant Colonel Kester Craig. Welcome to Conversations in State.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
All right, great to have you. Well, we're not only going to be dealing with one issue today. First off, I have to get accustomed to calling him Colonel Craig. First off, Colonel Craig, before we even talk about, because one of the things you would have been in the news for recently would have had to do with information being gathered regarding if there's a possible oil spill. And of course, viewers, this is necessary because we are now moving toward an oil economy. But even before we get to that, let's talk about some of the things that the CDC would have been doing in the last 2 years or so. I know last year you had a very busy year with a very busy hurricane season. So let's talk about some of the things you've done and what the CDC would have achieved.
All right. I think the Civil Defense Commission, as people would know by now, is the National Disaster Agency, a National Disaster Risk Management Agency that not only responsible to respond to a particular hazard impact like floods, drought, health hazard, oil spill, but to work on reducing the country's risk to the impact of any of those hazards. So when we work on reduce the risk of, say, flood or drought, if something do occur, the amount of finances that you will spend on response would significantly reduce. So you want to have a nation that is focused on risk reduction and creating an enabling environment for social and economic development. So within that background, we have been working on developing our national disaster risk management system. And at the top of that system is a risk reduction platform chaired by the Honorable Minister of State, Joseph Harmon. And that platform would meet quarterly to identify issues in all the sectors and what sectors can do to reduce their risk. So it's more of a policy level platform that meets and see what's burning issues that what we need to put in place to reduce risk across the entire country. And a part of that, you have several plans at the national level that we have developed over the years, and we are working on the implementation of those plans, which include an integrated disaster risk management plan, a flood response plan, preparedness and response plan, multi-hazard preparedness and response plan. And we could go along. There's so many policy that we have done. But now we're working on the actual implementation of those policies at the national level. Then we come down to the regional level, and we've completed 7 regional disaster risk management systems in region 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And we're currently working in region 9 and 10, and hopefully by the end of this year we will finish 9 regions. Yesterday region 4 is left for last because of the complexity. And the plan to work on the system in 2019 for region 4.
So in doing that, what you're saying is that it's more complex than region 4? That's surprising.
Yeah, I think in terms of the one, you have a larger population to deal with.
Okay.
We have more fixed assets and other assets to deal with, and it's called for serious, significant modeling, because what we're doing is not only just developing a plan, it starts with a risk assessment. And the risk assessment is complex, using GIS specialists to identify the risks and the different hazards that affect in the particular regions. And the whole system includes the risk assessment and develop a risk profile for the region that each region can use for informed decision making. It includes setting up a risk management committee at the regional level,
Okay.
setting up emergency operations center at the regional level, and also walking them through the paces for implementation.
So they don't necessarily always have to depend on headquarters or
Right, excellently, excellent. That's the way we're trying. That's the way we're going, because a disaster is considered when it overwhelms a particular locality, overwhelm the capacity of a particular locality. So, for example, if a community cannot cope, it becomes a disaster for the community. And if the region cannot cope, it becomes a disaster for the region. So, with these systems in place, regions are now required to respond to their emergencies or the particular hazard impact. And what the CDC will be doing now is to give a more supporting role. And if the capacity is overwhelmed for that particular region, that's when the CDC is going to come into play. So right now, we're working very closely with the regions. So you may not be seeing the CDC visible as the agencies on the ground, especially in the remote regions, but you'll see the regional executive officer, the regional chairman, their program heads responding to the whole say flood or drought that's affecting that particular region. But we will be giving them support. If it overwhelms the capacity, that's when we will be required to respond.
I'm happy when you talk about the region. I mean, I don't know if the weather forecasters would agree with me here or not, but sometimes when we have unusual weather patterns, like for example freak storms and so on, I think we had one or two of those last year. These most oftentimes affect our hinterland regions and hinterland communities. With everyone talking about, and it's not just that people are talking about it, it is actually real, with meaning the onset of climate change. Do you find that disaster risks have increased, and are they, challenging for the CDC?
In some areas, you might see an increase, for example, in storms. In some cases, you may see a reduction in floods. So it varies, and it varies on season. What we observed, particularly last year, when there was a passage of Hurricane Irma, Jose, and Maria, we had several high winds that affected Region 7.
Yes.
So that's something we're looking at, and come the next hurricane season, we need to monitor it and see. It starts in June 1st to see if there's a direct relation. Well, talking to some of the experts, they're saying yes, there's a direct relation, and yes, the hurricane passing off the coast of Guyana could have an impact to a certain region, certain location in the country.
All right. Because we are talking about changes in weather patterns and so on, and hurricanes, again, as I did say earlier, I know you had a very busy year last year because the CDC would have had to help and lend support to our CARICOM sisters, brothers and sisters, after they were, unfortunately, some of them were, for example, Barbuda, I know, was completely destroyed by one of the hurricanes. Has that to some extent drained the CDC? And in such events, is the CDC working along with whatever bodies in those countries as it relates to disaster risk management to ensure that people are safe?
All right. I don't think the CDC is actually trained. Yes, we have an increased amount of workload, but we try to get our job done in innovative ways. One such innovation is the volunteer corps that we have established in 2012. We have volunteers, we have technical specialist volunteers, and we also have general volunteers. So whenever our capacity reaches that we need additional assistance, we send out messages to our volunteers that they come and support our operation. And during the year, we train them in all the area of operation. We train them in emergency operations center management, we train them in damage assessment, we train them in shelter management. And whenever we have activity, we have them involved in our system so they understand our system. And volunteers are also done at all the regional level that support the regional system. So in terms of working with the other agencies, we work closely with our parent regional body called the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, SIDEMA, and we would be in constant contact with them during the hurricane season. As a matter of fact, they just sent a list asking for people to be on standby in the event that something happened in those countries. Because what happened last year, based on prediction, is likely to see similar impact happening again. And what what we found is that it overwhelmed the regional response capacity.
Okay.
So they have certain units called the CDRU, the CARICOM Disaster Relief Unit, that made up mainly of military, police personnel from the entire Caribbean. And that particular unit was actually overwhelmed because you had to deploy personnel to several countries at the same time. And we're also looking for our volunteers to train them to a level that they could go and support the regional system. Matter of fact, myself and another officer from the CDC would have been deployed to assist the countries. I was actually in Dominica for a couple of weeks, and the devastation that you see there, you won't want to wish it on your worst enemy. All the roofs were off. There's no water. There's no telecommunication. Everything was beyond what you would want to imagine.
Even before that, though, do you find that, because I know you're working on it now also, but do you find that our people, our volunteers, you did mention that you yourself was deployed, do you find that you would have been mentally prepared for that? Because again, Guyana, we're so blessed, and I like to remind people, we're so blessed, unfortunately, that we're not located in the hurricane belt, so to speak, even though we would get freak storms and heavy winds and so on every now and again. Do you find that our people, including yourself, would have been mentally prepared for that? Because again, we don't live it. So, how did you cope with that? And again, are our people mentally prepared, and will they be properly trained?
It will have a psychological impact on anyone that visited those areas. I think luckily for me, when I visited, there was a little bit of recovery, was already recovery stage. So I did not get to see maybe person that lost their lives. I didn't get to see most of what I saw the destruction. But definitely it will have psychological impact on people. And in disaster management, there are supposed to be systems for psychological support. So after you finish operation on the field, there's supposed to be a debriefing session. And if persons are feeling, depressed and, out of state, their mind, they will be counseled and, so they have those type of mechanisms in place to bring some relief to people who will be overwhelmed by the whole situation within the country. That's something we are working to integrate in our system here.
Okay.
I recently had some discussion with the mental health unit of Ministry of Health to have them part of our response system, because we need to have all the different players on board. So when something happens, you have the systems in place so that you won't have more devastation, because the first responders are key, and you need them to be in the best state of mind.
And I'm happy about that, because we always talk about all of this development and all the training we're doing, and nobody considers. Well, I shouldn't say no one, but it's not where we want it to be as yet in terms of considering people's mental health state. Let's now move on to, of course, viewers, those of you now joining. Of course, today's conversations in state, we're focusing on the CDC, Civil Defense Commission. Of course, you've heard Colonel Craig talking about some of the things the CDC would have done and continue to do in order to strengthen the CDC and the workers of the CDC. Now let's talk about one of the things you've been in the news, the CDC would have been in the news for recently, and that has to do with, let me see if I get this right, a contingency plan. You are in the process of drafting a contingency plan in the event of an oil spill. Of course, we're talking oil economy and everything oil. First off, where is that plan now at this point?
Before I start off with the plan, I just want to put some things into context. I think since their exploration commenced and we found oil offshore, everyone has this perception that anytime now there's going to be an oil spill. What people need to understand is that the probability of a large oil spill happening offshore is very small. I think one of the reasons why it's small, first of all, the rig is located 100 miles offshore Guyana. And based on the projection that we have seen, the modeling that we have seen, worst case scenario, if there is a major oil spill, say for example 7,000 barrels of oil per hour, it would take about 14 days to 21 days to meet the shore.
The shore.
And That's without any form of intervention. However, eh, oil and gas companies, they will always try to um, ensure they have a good reputation. So they have invested significantly in safety because it's their business. If they have an operation every couple of days or weeks, they have an oil spill, then they would lose credibility. So they have so many safety mechanisms in place, and I'll probably outline some of them. So, for example, once there is a, let's say, a major oil spill,
Mm-hmm.
the first measure that will be taken on the rigs, there's a very large equipment called the blowout preventer, or BOP for short.
Okay.
And that's a very sophisticated equipment, and that would shut off the wherever there is a spill almost immediately, and has three layers for safety. If that doesn't work, then there is booms that they will try to no, there is booms that will try to contain the oil to prevent it from going downstream. And during the containment of the oil, they will now use vessels to recover those oil, and they'll also use something called dispersants to spray to disintegrate the oil. Um, if that doesn't work, they would get planes coming from different locations to use spray dispersant to disintegrate the oil so that it could go below the surface and not get to the shore.
And again, all of this is happening in the water.
In the
so
water,
it still
outside.
hasn't, as we thought, we speak, it still hasn't
We
reached
still
the
haven't
shore.
reached close to the shore, and
Okay.
all those mechanisms are happening. Apart from that, if still you have the oils and they cannot contain it or they cannot stop the leaking um, uh, uh, subsea, they have other mechanisms. They have something called subsea dispersants, and that's something go under the water, and before the oil come to the top, no matter how much is the quantity, it disintegrate that oil and keep it from flowing and increasing the likelihood of the spill. Apart from that, another equipment called the capping stack. There's a big heavy duty equipment, probably as big as probably the size of this building. And for example, typically there's about 23 in the world, and they're located strategically. For example, Exxon, they have a contractor called Oil Spill Response, and all this contractor does response to oil spill, and they have in place 4 capping stock within the world that could respond to this region. So there's one in Brazil, there's one in Singapore, there's one in Africa, and there's one in Norway. So whenever there is a major oil spill, immediately these capping stock started to um, they start shipping them to the location.
The location.
And this capping stack now with this big equipment that goes directly on top of where the spill and shut it off. So there's so many things that, in terms of safety, that would put in that will be put in place to ensure that oil doesn't reach the shore.
Even before CDC has to
Yeah,
intervene. And I'm happy that you cleared that up indeed.
And the thing is, all the oil company that are drilling, they are responsible for putting those measures in place. And it's very expensive to do it. And most of them, as a matter of fact, all I think, they are third party, like Oil Spill Response Limited, that they employed with all of these capabilities. Right? But where the CDC is necessary and where we're developing the plan is for the coordination. So you have, at that time, you'll have several ships coming into the country. You have vessels, you have aircraft, you have personnel, you have a whole sort of thing coming into the country. You have to have clearance for the use of dispersant, clearance for the landing of planes, helicopter. You have to have accommodation. So what the CDC and its partners needs to do is to have a contingency plan to ensure that the enabling environment is there to expedite the process so that all these equipment can come in country and contain and reduce the whole impact of the oil spill. Apart from that, you also have things like migratory path for wildlife, sea turtles, and those are things that the systems, the local system need to have in place for monitoring, so to protect them, because they may be passing the pathway. But coming on the shore, it has to be a
Highly
major,
unlikely.
major oil spill, and it's highly unlikely. The likely one, which I think we haven't focused on, is everyday transport of fuel on our roadways, the transport of fuel
Yeah,
in the
fuel.
rivers, the the storage facilities at Guyana, at Esso, and all the different companies, the vessels that are traversing
I'm
the
assuming all
area.
of that would be in your plan,
Good.
the
So that's what
contingency plan.
our plan is focusing on. Yes, the large one, but also the one that are very likely to happen. They could happen every day.
Yeah.
So we build our capacity to deal with those oil spills.
Okay.
Apart from that, the companies that are operating should have some form of equipment to respond to those local, small scale of oil spills.
I'm happy that you pointed to all of this because I can remember, I can recall a few weeks ago there was a big ruckus in the media about government and, of course, by extension, CDC not seeking
Mm.
international expertise. And in